Hello, everybody, and welcome. Now, the narrator today, I'm going to run you through the investigation of Flight 5622. Now, I know a lot of you will be very confused as to what in the world I'm saying. But here are two things that I have to say before we get into the investigation itself. First of all, watch the entire video because otherwise, most likely, you won't understand the entire topic or the entire discussion. And second thing, if you haven't already watched the first video, which is the crash of Flight 5622, I highly recommend watching it because otherwise this explanation might sound very confusing. So, without further ado now, let's get straight into the investigation itself. Now, with the crash of Flight 5622 spreading like fire across all of War Tycoon, the investigators at WTTSB or War Tycoon Transport Safety Board did not waste any time. The wreckage of Flight 5622 was transported to this hangar for further investigation of the plane's body for any clues to this mishappening, but also for two main things. The first thing is an FDR, and the second thing is a CVR. Now you might be wondering, what is a FDR and a CVR? Well, an FDR or flight data recorder is a system that manages and records all the data of a flight, such as the altitude, speed, and etc. But the CVR or cockpit voice recorder has a much different job. As the name suggests, it is a voice recorder and it records any conversation between the pilot or any other additional sound that it can hear. So the CVR and FDR are both very crucial for the investigators to understand what happened to this flight. But as the plane was damaged quite a bit, the CVR and FDR, though in good condition, will take approximately 3 days to be converted into data form that the investigators can look into. But the investigators did not sit hands-free till then. Instead, they started investigating about other things that could give them clues to what had happened to Flight 5622. And the first thing they wanted to look at was the security cameras at Alpha Base. You see, there were 4 security cameras at Alpha Base. Security camera 1 or base center security camera. Security camera number 2 or vehicle bay security camera. Security camera number 3 or second base center security camera. And finally, security camera number 4 or base exterior security camera. Now, out of all 4 of these security cameras, the one we need to look at is security camera number 4 or base exterior security camera. And this is the footage from that camera from at the time of the crash. Let's just take a look at the footage. Did you notice anything? I bet you didn't. But if we zoom in top center of the footage, we can see a little something coming in. Let's just take a look at it. Did you notice something now? If you didn't notice something after that, you might need to get your eyes checked. But if you did, it is the silhouette of Flight 5622. And that is the footage of about the final seconds of the flight. Now, with the investigators analyzing the CCTV footage for any more further clues, the investigators did find one odd thing that they didn't expect. And it was a sudden movement of the plane about at the end of this flight sequence. Right at the end, sort of about 10 seconds before the second impact onto the hill, the plane seemed to lose altitude quickly as it seemed to increase its pitch down, which was unusual, especially at the altitude that they were at, seen through the CCTV footage. And later, it was seen as the plane did increase its pitch a bit, but then the plane crashed into the side of a hill. Now, this mystery was left hanging for now, and you might be wondering why. Well, it's because the investigators wanted to cover one more thing in these 3 days, and that was the communication between the ATC and the pilot of Flight 5622. So the investigators now asked the air traffic controller that was on duty at the time of the crash of Flight 5622 some questions, but the investigators did not get what they were hoping for, as the air traffic controller told them that the weather at the time was decent and also that there were no indications of any problems of the flight until the final few words spoken by the pilot, which were, "This is Flight 5622 going down. I repeat, going down." Now, though the investigators had gone through quite a bit of stuff, they really weren't able to make much of more progress into understanding what happened to this flight. So the investigators were really hoping that the black boxes would give them the pieces to this puzzle to finally solve it. Now, with both the FDR and the CVR being ready for analyzing, the investigators were very keen and were hoping that this would at least give them a bit of information. And it not only gave them information, but it gave them information in a huge amount. Let's take a look. Now, though an FDR shows many different things about the plane and displays a lot of data, the one we need to focus on is altitude and speed. This is the data of the altitude and speed corresponding at the time of the crash. And we can see a very interesting pattern that you wouldn't normally see. Let's break down this data. First of all, at the altitude of 550 feet, the speed of the plane was about hovering at 94 knots, and it was decreasing. Now, this is very concerning, as for this type of plane, the stall speed is 90 knots. And actually, later in the graph, we can see that this plane hits the stall speed at about 90 knots, and right at that time, it immediately starts to increase its speed, but also at the same time decreasing its altitude. Now, for those of you who don't understand what a stall speed is, a stall speed is basically linked to a stall. And this is the important thing, because a stall is when a plane doesn't have enough lift for it to be maintained in the sky. And this means that a stall can be catastrophic. Now, there are two ways a stall can occur. And the first one is if the plane has a too high angle of attack or upward pitch. And the second way is if the plane just doesn't have enough speed. So if the power, so the thrust levels are set to a low limit. And either one of those will cause a stall. And a stall speed is a speed limit that is set for a plane to always be higher than when flying in the air so that the plane does not go into a stall. Now, there are many other things that are built in to prevent a stall. But sometimes these things or sudden actions that the planes do can actually cause another problem in itself. And we'll be seeing that pretty soon. Anyways, though the investigators had roughly figured out that the plane had a stall in its final few moments, the investigators still did want to take a look at the CVR to see what clues that would give them. And it gave them a big clue. And that was that in the final words that the captain said, behind his voice, we could hear something. Now, the sound itself might not be very clear, but when you cut out the pilot's words, this is what you can hear. Now, for those of you who still don't get what that warning was, which I doubt there's only a few, that is the stall warning, as it literally said in the warning itself. And as I said earlier, a stall can be catastrophic, especially at this height. And now the investigators knew for sure that the stall had to do something with this accident. Now investigators started to look at different things that could relate to a stall happening this late. In the investigators' minds, there were two main reasons how a stall could happen. Either there were some technical difficulties with the plane, or it was pilot error. Now, normally you might be expecting an investigator to go with pilot error first, as a human is much more likely to make a mistake than a machine. But in this specific accident, the investigators decided to go and take a look at the technical log of the plane first. And there's a reason for that. Now, the reason why the investigators decided to take a look at the technical status of the aircraft is because the aircraft isn't particularly new, but also isn't particularly old. It's a weird thing because the aircraft itself is a P-51 Mustang, a WW2 aircraft. You know how I emphasize WW2? Many of you will have picked up the clue. And many of you will have realized that what is a WW2 fighter jet doing in the present day fleet of the Alpha base? Well, to that I'd say a very good question indeed. Because this plane had supposedly made a comeback into the Alpha base fleet, and this plane had only been in the fleet for the past 4 months. Do you now see why the investigators were kind of keen on looking through the maintenance records and were hoping that they were going to find clues? Well, let's take a look at them as well. Though the investigators really expected for at least one clue, the maintenance records didn't give them any. The maintenance record only showed that the plane was spot on with its maintenance checks and had no issues in the past 4 months. This led the investigators to check one final thing, and that is the pilot's records. The original pilot's records had a lot of information. So here is a shortened summary of the entire record. First of all, one thing we need to point out is the pilot's experience. Now, the pilot, John Ashley, was a veteran with over 12,000 hours of flying experience, but only 400 of those hours were on the P-51 Mustang, and that is because the plane is relatively new. So that's one interesting thing. Another interesting thing is the fact that the captain, when originally applying for a military license, had a couple of problems. And one of them were that he was very prone to get panicked when he was put under stress in a quick instance. And sometimes, if one thing had gone wrong, he would focus on that one thing too seriously and had a hard time monitoring multiple things, which could tell us that the captain's multitasking abilities are not that great. Now the investigators started to realize and piece together a picture of what actually happened to this flight. Could the reason this crash happened be due to an inexperienced pilot? Well, if you thought that, you would be actually right. Here is what happened. It all happened on that fateful day when Flight 5622 was cleared to take off from Alpha Base. The plane's mission was to destroy 3 targeted bridges. The plane started to go back towards the Alpha Base for its first attempt at landing. The plane had to go around and climb back up into the air. And then the plane called the ATC for a second approach onto the Alpha Base runway. And at that moment, the captain's old mistakes of focusing on one thing too much kicked in. Also, his inability at multitasking also kicked in at this right moment. And this led him to let the speed and altitude go too low. And with that, the plane went down.